Over the last few years of working in crypto, I've accrued more NFTs and altcoins and random crypto assets than I can count across more chains than I can remember. And it's always been a struggle to find a single crypto wallet where I can track everything I own. That is, until I discovered Zerion. Zerion Wallet is for everything you own on-chain. Yes, that includes all of your assets across more than 14 different networks. Zerion is giving people the chance to be true owners by making it simple to explore, collect, mint, test, and contribute to the new internet. Go to zerion.io/download today to take ownership over your on-chain assets, available on iOS, Android, and desktop. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Irina Panovich, aka aiio, about nonlinear models for cultural production, the importance of physicality in play when exploring emerging tech, and the importance of experimentation in crypto. For the last 5 years or so, aiio has been experimenting with an arts and tech collective in Copenhagen called 320 Colab, testing out various theories relating to funding for artists and creatives. This is her first time sharing publicly on a podcast about her experiences and learnings there, and I'm super grateful she felt comfortable enough to share openly about all of this for the first time on Rehash. We talk a lot in this episode about experimenting in crypto, especially with community and culture, and aiio shares some key learnings and advice for building a community around foundational values and using human-centered design. aiio also gives us a sneak peek into a new project she's been working on that will be launching soon, a new podcast with UFO that she'll be using to experiment with new forms and models for podcasting. By the way, we've recently migrated our community over from Discord to Telegram. So if you haven't done so yet, please join our Telegram group at t.me/rehashweb3 so you don't miss the latest at Rehash. aiio was nominated by Nick Hollins and voted onto the podcast by Kabuki, Nick Hollins, Karsten, and Triumph. So without further ado, here's my conversation with aiio. aiio, thank you so much for joining us today on Rehash.
Thanks so much. So happy to be here. And thanks for everyone that supported in coming here.
Yes. Shout out to Nick for nominating you and everybody for voting you on. I want to just go ahead and dive right on in and talk about a project that you've spent the last 5 years or so working on, which is 320 Colab, a sound, art, and tech experimental collective in Copenhagen, which is where you're based. I'm so curious to hear where you got the idea for this project and what all it encompasses. I just gave a one-liner intro of it. I don't know if I did a good job of that or not, but I'd love to hear it explained from your own words.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think you said it well. Actually, it's a pretty nice story. I'd like to, first start with this kind of crazy dive that I was encountered with and how I actually got to know the place. And then I'll talk a little bit to kind of the thoughts and process behind setting it up. So actually, it was about 7 years ago when I got to know the place, and it was quite random. It was a really good friend of mine who was part of that collective because it was in its entirety before we tore it down because we had to move out. This year, it was existing for 8 years in a really unique place on the outskirts of the city here in Copenhagen. It was a garage space that guys before used and built up as a studio. So I got to know them through a mutual friend, and at that time, the guys were playing music, recording there, and putting out music. And I got to know it because this one cold winter evening, I got invited there, and you knock on the door. It's a garage, so it opens up like this, and I had no idea what to expect. And this incredible scene appeared. It was candle lit, old school sofas, full concert setup, video recording, about 30 people there, and they were filming a music video that night. And we ended up spending, I don't know how many hours there, and I was just sitting on top of this construction container that was inside this garage. This garage itself was like 160 square meters. And I was sitting there and I was like, oh my days, what is this place? Because you don't really come across this kind of spaces every day, especially in the city. And then I got to know them, and basically they built up from scratch this space for music. And a couple years later, they actually reached out and said that they are planning to move out because it's quite big and it was hard to keep up. And, sometimes in life these kind of crazy opportunities come up, and I was like, okay, let me think about this for a sec. And at that time I was doing my master's here in Copenhagen. I was studying innovation and entrepreneurship. So I was surrounded by people who were really keen on exploring new business models and exploring new ideas of how to create things. So I spoke to a lot of people in those 2 months with the intention to set up an environment, a space where people from different areas of expertise can come and tinker with things. And yes, it's centered around music and art and tech, but also people from really different backgrounds, from engineering, software development, architecture, construction, music also, came together and said, hey, here's 10 of us here. We all feel like we are lacking a space in the city where we can just explore ideas that are maybe outside of our day-to-day work and day-to-day studies. So, you know what, let's put the money together and just take it over. So that's what we did. And that was pretty crazy because the thing that we had certain was the vision, but we really didn't know how we're going to maintain it or build it up. So actually that idea of experimentation was really integral to its beginning, because through that process of curiosity and figuring out how to build a community collective space, we actually got to where it is today. So yeah, that's kind of how I got to know it. It was thanks to a lot of different people who came together over a shared idea.
That really does feel like serendipity, right? Like, what are the chances that you walk into a random garage that's a whole vibe, and then 2 years later they came back to you and approached you with this idea? So as you're taking over this project and you have this vision for the project and you're wanting to experiment with all of these things, as is true with anybody that runs experiments, I think we have a thesis in our mind of what is going to happen with this experiment. So, like my thesis with Rehash was that a community owned and a community governed podcast would be better than a traditional podcast. And I set out to prove whether that was right or wrong. And so I'm wondering, what was your thesis with 320 Colab when you took over the project and decided to run it? What were you expecting or hoping was going to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that was really integral to its longevity also. Previously, I was working in a creative agency that was actually experimenting with new model of connecting artists. So instead of creating something in-house, we would actually work with a lot of crowds, like design crowds, and curate across the commercial client and also the artist. So we were kind of an intermediary at that point. And in that, I was immersed in the kind of commercial creative scene, both locally and also internationally. And also previously, my experience in working in a publishing house showed me that at the core of it, the commercial creative industry is really fast-paced. And what I saw was that a lot of artists were getting burnt out, and a lot of artists were actually taking on separate gigs or, working part-time in a bar or trying to just get by and make ends meet, because the effort was not paid for properly, but also a lot was expected from them. And what happened was that a lot of the artists were kind of pushed to develop product at the expense of the process. And I saw that as a recurring pattern within environments that I found myself in. And that actually led me to think, and also backed by research, because at that time I was studying this also in my master's. I was looking at hyper-financialization of creative processes and creative industries. So I saw it in theory, and I also saw it in practice. And I thought that there is a space for exploring non-linear models of value exchange, and also seeing how that could be facilitated more peer-to-peer. Can artists support each other in creating something without having to rely necessarily on VC funding or some kind of big commercial clients, and actually challenge that further and say, okay, can we actually make some kind of collective that is not driven by profit as its primary goal? So that was kind of the hypothesis, and the whole idea was to challenge this, create a little bit friction in what was becoming a more homogenized world of creativity that I was experiencing at that time. More like personally, I also felt that it would be really nice to have a space where there is freedom to express in whatever form that is, in whatever craft that is, but just be able to be loud. And if you want to pick up a brush and paint on the wall, you can do that. So have a little bit more freedom outside of the day-to-day. And actually, that kind of thinking was also a core of what we did in terms of focusing on play, like on the role of play in creating something. I think, and also I was reading the book by Rick Rubin, The Creative Act, and there he also talks about play and how in creating art, maybe it's a good idea not to take it so seriously, because in that moment of relaxation and no boundaries, and in this moment of imagination, a lot of really good creative work can emerge. And that kind of idea we took and applied in the kind of the day-to-day process of developing projects. And that was really fun and also very difficult, actually, because it was really about finding a balance between, when there are no boundaries, but then when you do have to set some deadlines and some direction. So it was a continuous flow of figuring that out throughout these years. And that was really fun.
I'm curious to hear more about that, but I want to go back and dive a little deeper into what you said earlier, which was the non-linear framework. Can you talk a little bit more about how you saw that playing out, or how it actually did play out over the last 5 years, with this idea that maybe artists could support one another and maybe they didn't have to rely on the traditional methods of making money and creating a living from being an artist without having to work all those extra hours at the bar or side jobs here and there? Can you talk a little bit more about how you saw that playing out in practice, and maybe give some examples too, if there are concrete examples you can call out of projects that actually succeeded in this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the hypothesis, was to challenge that monetary model and see if that we can create an alternative to support artists. In practice, that actually proved really difficult. It's really difficult to raise funds if you're bootstrapping, and also actually when you're tied to a physical space, because what ended up happening is that a lot of our effort in generating capital, and we did that through private events, we did that through facilitating workshops, through collaboration. We also got a few sponsorships, actually from Ethereum Foundation, because we were co-hosts of the Ethereum meetup here in Copenhagen. So we did try to have a diversified income streams from the activities that we did. However, because it was very project specific, and also we also didn't want to have a focus on monetizing our activities, but we wanted to become sustainable. So a lot of the income that we generated was going towards the rent. And then whatever surplus that we had, we tried to have like a treasury, I guess, and we voted on how that would be used. So, for example, we at one point generated some surplus from a collaboration that we did. We were able to pay the artists, and then over time we had maybe some money put away to invest in a mixer for the studio, because we were doing a lot of production. And we voted on, okay, that's a priority now, let's go for that. But anyway, the point is that it was really difficult to create a sustainable bottom line from doing projects like that. And therefore, we saw that a lot of the value actually came from, because we're doing also a lot of collaboration with other collectives in the city, also internationally, and the value came from being able to share space. So for example, some artists, they were looking to release an EP that they were launching, and they were looking for a place to do it in collaboration with someone who would also be there, to support with lights and maybe some kind of warm-up act. So a lot of the value that we found was not monetary. That was actually residing in other values, like aesthetic value, technical resources that we already had. We had a space, and that was really attractive for people. So our whole model also revolved around that kind of idea of collaboration and sharing. And that was really exciting because, a lot of the projects that we did was mutually beneficial for everyone, but not in a monetary sense. So it was a challenge to figure out how we're going to make our rent, but how we also make it affordable and inclusive for artists to actually have access to such resources. So one thing that we did continuously every month was an open jam, where it was just free for everyone to come and play on the instruments that we have. But that freedom of access came because by that time we set up a membership structure. So everyone who was a daily resident would pay a certain membership fee, and that fee would accrue to then be able to support free events for the community. And then we would monetize then private events that were bigger, and we can, have ticketed experiences. So it was this juggle of different type of projects, figuring out how to make it accessible, but at the same time not charging artists who couldn't afford. And some projects we ran completely for free, and some experiences we did the ticketing to be able to pay the participating artist for that specific event.
So I'm curious, what are your views now in terms of this original hypothesis that you set out to test in your experiment? From seeing everything that you saw over the last 5 years, do you still believe in this thesis that there are other ways for artists to create sustainable streams of income? Or have you backtracked on that? Or say you were to start over 320 Colab again today, how would you run that experiment differently?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think still artists fall into like the bigger framework of the way industry runs. And what I've learned is that the industry is really run on short iterations. So for example, if you're creating an event, all the monetary value is tied to that specific event, and the artist is kind of tied to that event being a success in terms of, let's say, ticket sales. And also that extrapolates not just in the context of what we were experimenting with, but also in the wider industry. For example, when venues are creating an event, a lot of the benchmarks there is like how much tickets is the artist going to sell. That means how many people are going to come to the venue and go to the bar. And then it actually inhibits some artists to get booked because maybe they are emerging artists, or maybe they are playing really experimental stuff that it's for a very niche audience, and that creates a disadvantage because then these artists are not platformed at the same level as artists that are selling out bigger venues, for example. And that's talking in the context of a physical performance. Compared to 5 years ago, I think there are emergent tools, especially in the Web3 space, that are enabling artists to sustain themselves in a different way and generate value through more interaction online, which I think was not possible maybe 5-6 years ago to this extent. And I think there's a huge potential there. And this is also what we were trying to explore on a smaller scale and kind of test it out in the physical form. So like identify what kind of value flows could there be through these kind of different interactions. But I still think it's really early days, and a lot of the quote unquote success, I don't know how to define success at this point, but I guess let's just say in terms of traction and being able to sustain themselves financially, there's still a big gap between those who are operating already in the Web3 space, but also like the artists and creators who are not yet familiar with the space. And I think this is a really important moment because there's an opportunity to kind of share that knowledge and educate or give access to tools and explain, okay, this is a new way that you can release a song, and on that moment of purchase, that's not the final moment of relation, like you can have a continuous interaction with your audience over time, whereas what the status quo industry is like, you buy a ticket, you go to the event, and that's it. That's the end of the relation. And I think this movement towards a continuous interaction with your audience and also directly with creatives is still to be explored in depth. We're seeing there are a lot of great cases popping up and have been developing in the last couple of years, and hats off to projects like Songcamp and Catalog and UFO also and Mira and all of these projects that are really platforming artists like that and giving autonomy over their releases. So I'm, I guess, in a very long-winded way saying that I'm still exploring, and this is also why I'm really excited about the next steps, because I'm actually taking this idea and learnings from operating in a physical space and seeing what is possible in the bridge across digital and physical environments.
That was literally going to be my next question to you is, do you think that the physical aspect of 320 Colab was necessary for what you were trying to accomplish? Or do you think that maybe you could have accomplished even more and found even more success had you expanded beyond your local community of Copenhagen and made it a digital experience that people from all over the world could join?
Yeah, maybe. Actually, it's important to say that it still exists. We had to move out of the space because of the urban development plans of that area, where they are building like a luxury residential area instead of a creative quarter. This is a very classic move of gentrification. So we had to move out, and we actually found a new space, a much smaller studio in a hub that is also like a DIY grassroots environment with other amazing collectives who are working with audio, visual, generative art, sound design, and all of this. So we just relocated, and because it's on a smaller scale, it enables for a bit different activities where the residents are focused on their own production, producing music. There's a really great music coming out of there. Shout out to Liminal State. If anyone's curious, I'll definitely share a link. He's releasing some new music. So I think it depends what. I think it was very timely in terms of downsizing the studio space and focusing on the residents that are there physically. I think it would have been a totally different endeavor if we were focused initially on having external communication on socials and things like that, which that was not our main focus. We were really focused on developing per project and also collaborating kind of very heart to heart with the collectives in the space. So it's very hard to say how it would be if it was different. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's important that it was grounded in a local scale, local environment at that time, also because of the uniqueness of the area where it was located, which really was a cultural hub there.
It's a tough question, and it's something that I go back and forth on all the time, because if you go to these in-person crypto conferences, in-person events, and connect with people in person, it is a much different feeling than connecting with people over Twitter or online and online spaces. So I see that benefit, and I wonder if your community was strengthened by the fact that everybody was physically located in the same space. But at the same time, it does also sometimes feel limiting to not expand globally and reach all the people that you could be reaching. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that. I think the answer is probably somewhere in between, right? It's probably some combination of both. And it sounds like you guys did a really good job of that with engaging the local Copenhagen community, but then also, you know, collaborating on bigger events like ETH Copenhagen and stuff like that, where people from all over are coming in and exploring the space.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, that's a really good point, because I think it was really an antidote to this really fragmented, digital, noisy environment that we are so immersed in. And also, it was like 2020, it was COVID, we were anyway locked in, and actually having a physical space to go to and have an outlet for expression and being able to continue working on music and working on projects was really an amazing thing. So definitely in that context, the physicality of it was really important. And also conceptually, it made me think about kind of this disparity between how our everyday is so populated by so much noise that we get from the screen and from media, and how that place was almost like a refuge and like a landing spot. You know, you would come there and you would chill for a sec, you would land, and then have energy to explore something else. Also because everyone who's involved works full-time on the site. So this is something that we did in our spare time. So it also was a little bit like a refuge for exploring creativity and experimentation. And I think there was a motive for having something very physical in this age of fragmentation.
I speak from experience when I say that launching a DAO is not easy work. I've spent countless hours trying to figure out how to manage a community, get people to vote on proposals, and figure out how to set everything up on chain. Tally does all of that hard work for me while providing a full suite of tools for my community to create drafts, collaborate on proposals, incentivize voting, and most importantly, stay safe and secure on chain while doing it all. Tally is the home of DAO governance. Launch your DAO with Tally at tally.xyz. Something else you mentioned earlier, too, is this concept of play. And as we're talking about this physicality and bringing in also what you mentioned earlier about this concept of play and emphasizing that a lot within your community, how do you see these concepts fitting into more of a tech community? Like most of the listeners here are in the crypto space, or at least in tech in some way, and emerging tech specifically. How do you see these concepts of physicality and play applying to more of a tech space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I've been in the crypto space since 2019. I actually started from a nonprofit angle working with the public sector here in Denmark. We actually started the first pilot project here with the social services and a local municipality here. They were really curious and explorative. So I was always drawn to this technology of what it can do beyond finance. And I think that kind of thinking has allowed me to keep a broad view on its possibilities. So that idea of play, when we're exploring it for like the creative industries and exploring it across interactions and exploring different value flows, allowed to think about tech and prototype certain things in a way where it was supporting what was going on in reality instead of creating tech infrastructure that would mold the behavior. So this idea of play and kind of releasing judgment and listening and actually observing what is going on is really important to be aware of when you are building tech. And this is actually something that is really prominent in a collaboration that I'm working on together with Holochain and Julia. Julia is a good friend of mine, and she's also very much in the crypto space. She's a data scientist. And what we're exploring is building an interface that is focused on human-centered design. So we're actually figuring out what kind of tool is useful for communities to have instead of what kind of communities can use this tool, if you know what I mean. So this idea of play allows to abstract a little bit and check yourself in terms of, am I imposing certain biases in this development? Am I making assumptions that are not there? It helps to look at the data with a fresh perspective, because in the process of play, you remove judgment, I think. So I think that is really important. And from the other side, I think it's important to look at the time, so at the development of where we are today in the crypto space. There's a lot of amazing tools out there. There's a lot of amazing possibilities in the context, let's say, of the creative space to build something that supports artists. I think we're still quite far away from tools that are accessible to people who are not familiar with crypto, let's say. So I think this move, and in general in the industry, move towards being more consumer friendly, creating tools that have amazing UX and tools that are accessible where you don't know that it's built on blockchain. I think we're in that moment that we're moving towards, and I think this year that's really also going to take off even more. Like you can just see Zora and its reception and how many people are joining it because it's easy to use and it's clear what's the point. And in that, I think it's very playful. So this idea of being able to interact with something that you get and that you can intuitively use is grounded in this idea of play.
Do you have any resources you can point people to that talk more deeply about these concepts, especially for any community builders listening who are constantly thinking about, like, how do we make our community better, find more tools to make the community enjoy being there and really having fun, and also seeing value that they're getting out of it at the same time? Do you have any like books or articles or people to follow or any resources that you can share for people?
Yeah, for sure. I'm really happy to share with you. Like, I'll put together some literature. I think all of this has culminated from years of research and reading about architecture and looking at human design in buildings and how that informs behavior. And my background is also in social sciences and innovation. So there's a lot of exploration between technological determinism and social development. And it's not either or, it's somewhere in between where we have to look more the actor networks and how they relate and not take certain relations for granted. And I think what sometimes I get a little bit disheartened about in tech is that this drive that it's this tool and it's this infrastructure over everything. And then we forget why we even are doing it. Why I joined in exploring blockchain and distributed tech was to see how we can actually create ways to communicate that are more meaningful and a bit more reflexive of our action in real life. So it's not anymore, this two-dimensional way of talking with each other, but it's a lot more variables that are included in the relations. Because also if we go back to this, the early hypothesis of like why I was interested in creating a community, like an experimental community, was to see if in the process we can create some kind of model that accounts for different values. And I think the tools that are coming up in Web3 can do this if we don't lose sight of why we started to do it in the beginning and not get overshadowed by this hype and speculative nature that financial markets tend to suck everyone into, and focus a little bit more on the local needs and the context of where this tech is being applied. So yeah, I'll definitely share some literature from different fields that are relevant for the tech space.
That would be great. And I'll link all of those in the show notes too, so people can find them easily. And I think this kind of leads me to thinking about, as we are now coming out of the bear market, going back into the bull market, I think more people are really thinking about and focusing on how do we bring crypto to the mainstream. And like you said, it's going to take better UX. It's going to take better consumer experiences. It's going to take more play, more fun, more of all of those things. As you think about how the culture is going to evolve from where the culture is now in the crypto space to where it will be in the future, assuming we do reach the next billion people and onboard them to crypto and reach the mainstream with crypto, how do you think about building out this culture in relation to how we've done it in the past? Like how culture has historically been built via these platforms, and how you see maybe a shift in the future of how we're going to develop culture, how culture can maybe be built in a better way than how we've done it in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad idea, because what is culture? I always find it difficult to define it because it's so diverse. So I like to think about, I guess, development, and in the context of urban development and and social community development in terms of collective intelligence. So this idea that more brains are better than one. So we are on our way to enabling that, where, for example, with understanding, that there are different voices, or there's in a DAO, for example, there's different people who are voicing their opinions and being able to actually influence decisions. You can see the breadth and the diversity of opinions that exist. So I guess culture that is diverse rather than homogenized is the first step to become aware of. I think if we look at also the tools that are being used today to communicate, in terms of, let's say, social media that is run by these big platform organizations, on a mass scale, I feel like it's tending to homogenize culture, and the incentives that are underlying that are based on attention grabbing and ad revenue models that we cannot really understand what the incentives are really. I mean, we understand that they're not actually serving or not supporting the users, the biggest contributors themselves. So the fact that we are trying to build tools that are first and foremost enabling people to voice their opinions and being able to see who is saying what, I think that's the first step to actually, causing a little friction in this homogeneous culture that exists today. And yeah, I think we should always fall back on this more human element of, like, what does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to have a conversation? What makes a group of people social? And I think in this point where we are building tools and the pace of innovation is so fast, this kind of more human approach to development is going to be really important. So we don't forget who and what we're building things for. Because it's very easy, and I've done it myself, it's very easy to get caught up in a project and see the finish line and just go towards it no matter what. But then it's important to keep in mind that things change all the time. So how do we create certain feedback loops, or how do we keep a tab on things that are happening across? And I think now we are able to see better what is happening across different communities, and people can connect directly and have a chat. The barriers of entry are much lower towards collaboration. And I think that's also the really important kind of wall to jump over if we are to figure out how we can work together, so we can reduce this level of polarization, maybe reduce loneliness, so we can actually live in more intentional communities and figure out how not to destroy our planet. Like, maybe that's the bigger thing, It's not like for tech's sake. Totally. It's like, how do we actually organize ourselves to collaborate and work towards a shared goal that's not just going to be designed for the short term, but it's going to have long-term positive impact.
I think the increased connectivity that we have to people globally is not only good for collaboration, giving us more people and more resources at our fingertips, but I think it also helps with that human understanding element of the fact that now it's so much easier for people to travel internationally and to see other cultures and experience other cultures and really have our eyes open to like this way of doing things that I'm used to, this mentality, this mindset that I'm used to. This is like a very capitalistic American mindset that I grew up in and that I hold, but that the rest of the world may not. And in the rest of the world and other parts of the world, this is how they think. And this is the mindset that they have and how they prioritize various parts of their life and things like that. And I think that is going to be hugely helpful too if we take advantage of this ability to travel and ability to experience other cultures and really understand other cultures and other parts of the world and how people experience life there. I think that will really help us too with building the type of culture, tech, everything that is really going to benefit people. But I do think that as I'm hearing you talk about culture becoming more and more homogenous type of problem, I do think that especially when we're talking about any kind of new emerging tech, that in the early days of that, it's really easy for people to have their own niche cultures and to really be able to express themselves authentically within any niche culture, no matter how small of a niche it is or how strange it is perceived to most people in the world. But I think as that technology becomes more and more developed, more and more widely adopted, so as we're talking about onboarding the next billion people to crypto and crypto being adopted by the mainstream, I think it's going to be hard to maintain a lot of these niche cultures that we see in crypto today or that we saw 5 years ago in crypto. I don't know if you have any thoughts or if you have the answers to that, but I guess if you do have any thoughts on, you know, how we can maintain culture that isn't homogenous and that is unique and that is special to us individually as we develop this tech and into what is mainstream.
I think that there's a couple of things there. More people that come into the space because the tools allow for creating your own governance structures and your own rules of the game and, you know, environments fit for your own context and your own communities. The diversity is going to be there. It's going to just be loads of different people doing loads of different things, and that's amazing. I think what we should be wary of is the underlying incentive structures. So right now, if we look at the Web 2 tools and social media, it's homogeneous in the sense that it's going for the same type of attention. So it's trying to yield and monetize the same eyeballs. The apps that are developed are going for our cognitive behavior, and it's actually molding the neuroplasticity of our brain. There's an amazing researcher from, actually I have her book right here, from Italy, Tiziana Terranova. It's called After the Internet. This is an amazing book, by the way. Recommend. I just here, so I just picked it up. In her research, she actually finds that the way that our attention is split at the moment, and when we are shifting attention very quickly from one thing to the other, it actually activates the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for short tasks and also routine things. When we're reading and when we're focused on one task for over a prolonged period of time, it's actually activating a different part of our brain, the hippocampus, that is responsible for critical reasoning. So actually the way we are using our attention right now and splitting across things is activating different parts of our brain. That is an innate incentive structure of the existing tools that are being used. I think that informs over a longer time culture. I think what we have the opportunity to do now is actually build tools, build educational tools, build apps, build things that people can use that is going to take attention not away from them, but actually nurture attention in a different way where it's not trying to like yield it. And I think that's going to be in the long-term effect of a more diverse and sustainable way of enabling tools for communication across people, because then people can take the time and choose who and how they interact with. They're not going to be driven by this one type of algorithm that is covertly seducing them into focusing on this one thing. And I think that's the difference. And the more people that join and the more people that discover for themselves this aha moment, like, oh, this makes sense. using crypto or using distributed tech here makes sense. No other tech makes sense, but this does. And I hope that more and more people will get the aha moment, because more and more tools will be accessible and easy to use. And I think that's going to be a really exciting time. And I can't wait for communities and people, individuals, artists to find their own way of using this technology. And I think that's the other point that is important, is that tools in this distributed tech space enable people to choose how they will be used. Whereas tools that exist today in the Web2 space, or this discoverability through an ad-based algorithm, you don't have really a choice in how to use that. Really. Like, of course, you can choose to post on Instagram or not, but at the end of the day, there's not much choice about how and what you can do with it.
We've all accepted the terms and conditions that nobody has read and that you have no chance of reading or understanding. But if you want to use the platform, you've accepted it, and that is what it is. And I do think that like user control and user ownership and just putting more power in the hands of the user is one of the main differences that Web3 is going to bring about. Well, I want to make sure that we also save some time for you to tell us about what you're working on now. And I know you've got one new project, which is a podcast that you're going to be launching through UFO. And I would really love to hear a little bit more about that, like how you're thinking about structuring it, what kinds of guests and topics you're going to be talking about there. So whatever you're able to share, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I'm so excited for this. And big up Nick, because we've been collaborating for some time now, and this project has come up really organically. And also recently, Light, Alexander Guy, and I and Nick had a chat on episode 50, and they are also launching their own shows. Check them out because they are really great, really interesting. And I'm planning to launch a show also. There's a couple of things that motivated me to do this. First of all, I am really curious about rethinking broadcasting in general and rethinking sharing craft and art. And I think UFO is a really cool platform for that, because it's using a combination of tools that exist in novel ways to allow communities to share, but also connect across. So I'm really excited about the possibilities of rethinking what a podcast could be. And also that's why I love being on this podcast, because the way that you are reimagining podcasting is really inspiring. So big up, Rehash. Happy to be here. Anyway, so I'm very excited about the infrastructure part there and the possibilities of joining across different communities. More specifically, what I'm planning, and I'm right now in the development phase where I'm reaching out to different guests and talking with people. First of all, it's a space where we can just have a conversation that we would have off camera anyway. We would just record it, And what I really feel like this podcast will be is just that, a space where people can share deeply what they are passionate about and what they're working on. For reference, I guess you can listen to a podcast that I hosted together with Nick and Moises. Moises is aka Hexorcismos. He is working with audio neural synthesis, and that was a really interesting conversation because we were able to explore the craft, but also go deeper into other topics, philosophy and AI and emerging tech. And that's kind of what I want to hold space for in the show. I won't give too much away right now because it's still in the process of getting guests confirmed, but it's going to be really exciting. And also because I'm in Copenhagen and there's a lot of really interesting music and art happening here kind of in the underground scene, I want to give space for that also to emerge and connect across the Web3. So I guess this podcast is also an invitation for collaboration, because right now I'm thinking of inviting guests, but also maybe it's going to be a collaborative podcast. Maybe it's going to be a community that comes to take over and do something and show what they're doing. So yeah, stay tuned. I won't say anything more, but it's really inviting people who are tinkering with some cutting edge things in the tech and art space to reach out if you have something to share, and have a listen to episode 47 of UFO to feel the vibe and see what you could be in for.
Was that the episode with Semilla?
Yes, with Semilla.
Was it that one?
With Moises.
Okay, yep. I do remember listening to that one. It was very good, and I thought you did a great job hosting. So I can't wait to listen to your podcast. I'm really excited. I'm always pro experimenting, as clearly you are as well. And so I'm really excited to see how you experiment with the podcast and what types of new formats and new forms of podcasting you bring into the mix. I think that's super exciting. So last question for you, Aiio. This is one that I ask every podcast guest on season 7, and it's going to feel a lot more degen than the rest of this conversation, but it's a two-part question. The first is, do you think ETH and or Bitcoin is going to reach an all-time high in 2024?
I think so, yes. I think that the way that it's going and with all the kind of macro factors surrounding it, I think so, yes. Although you never know how it's going to go. If you look at the long tail of things, it fluctuates slowly. If you zoom out and look at a 20-year thing, it's very hard to say. But I think next year, yes. I won't say the number because I don't want to speculate.
That was yes. The second part of my question is, what is going to be the high price of Ethereum and Bitcoin this year?
I don't have a crystal ball, so I think I will keep that to myself.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Last thing before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and then also where they can go to keep up with this new podcast that you're launching and make sure they don't miss it whenever it gets launched.
Yes, so you can follow me on Farcaster. It's aiio, AIIO, and the same on X, on Twitter. It's aiio @catfutur, CATTFUTUR. And there you can find the link tree and links to the things that I do. And you can also straight away actually check out UFO FM and look at the back catalog of all the podcasts. I think you'll find some very interesting conversations there. And yeah, stay tuned for it appearing there at some point in the spring. And thank you so much. It's been really great to chat. And yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great.
Of course. Yeah, I've had so much fun talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again next Thursday with another episode of Rehash. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Diana Chen, and sponsored by Zerian, Tally, and Quest. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. Collectors will also be able to tune into our recordings live at pleaser.house and hear our episodes early and unedited. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Warpcast or Lens at Rehash. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.